Welcome back to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and with me today are both Senior Fellow Alan Dowd and our Senior Analyst Laurence Sanford. Thank you, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
And we're going to discuss the Israeli war on Hamas and how the world is weighing in on it. Alan Dowd's most recent article is titled "Savagery Abroad, Poison at Home," and he'll have part 2 going out next week as well. Laurence Sanford has articles on China and Hamas, China and Iran, and recently China and Hezbollah. And all of these articles can be viewed on our website at www.ascf.us. Please sign up for our newsletter and consider becoming a member. So without further ado, gentlemen, thank you for joining me today for this discussion on the Israeli war and Hamas and how the world is weighing in on this. You have both written in your articles that you both consider Hamas a terrorist organization. Hamas committed an atrocious massacre on October 7th against Israeli citizens. Yet, when Israel retaliated to take out Hamas, there's been a global outcry for a ceasefire, so thousands of civilians aren't killed in the process, and to bring humanitarian aid to the wounded. We know that the Palestinians in Gaza voted Hamas into power back in 2006, and there hasn't been an election since. So my first question to both of you is, if fair, and I use the word fair lightly, election was held prior to this massacre, in your opinion, do you think the Palestinians would have reelected Hamas?
I can let Larry go first.
Sure, Larry, okay. Your thoughts?
I'll go first. I think they would win. Not only they're a terrorist organization, but like Hezbollah, they're also a social organization. So they provide services to the population. And they have the situation that they're an Islamic terrorist organization, and many people believe into the Islamic code of discrimination, of hating Jews and killing Jews. So I think that Hamas's creed is to get rid of the Jews and then get rid of Israel and the Jews. And so I think that belief system would have Hamas be the electoral leader in Gaza. Just like in the West Bank, Abbas has been there for years. He hasn't had an election either. So, and he's afraid of having an election because he's afraid of Hamas would win. So they're all on the same page. They all hate Jews. They all want to drive Western civilization out of the Middle East, and for that matter, to end Western civilization. So I think they'd win the election again.
I would just note a couple of things about it's a good question, and it's some of Larry's points make a lot of sense. There are polls that were conducted a couple months, maybe a little less than a year before the October 7 massacre, and they indicate that Hamas, as Larry said, would probably win again at the ballot box. I say again because Hamas did win an election in 2006 for the Palestinian Legislative Council's seats. They won a majority in that. But the polls show that 70% of Palestinians oppose a two-state solution and 52% support armed conflict over negotiations. So that really does kind of echo or emphasize or reinforce some of what Larry was saying. I would say this, though, there is it's possible that polling is always it's an imperfect science. It's possible that there are people who answer things to pollsters that they may not actually do or may not actually believe just for fear in a place like Gaza. And of course, I would say that there is a difference between the necessary and I think honorable cause of Palestinian statehood and the vile cause that Hamas is pursuing. As Larry said, that is to eradicate Jews, that is to erase Israel. So I do think there's a distinction there. It does seem to me that the West Bank PA, the Palestinian Authority, is clearly much more moderate. It talks to the Israeli government, tries to work with Western and moderate Arab countries to try to get to two states, shoulder to shoulder or arm in arm, an Israeli and a Arab state. So, but I think, Larry, it's hard to argue with the numbers that show that 70% of Palestinians say they oppose two states, and a majority said they would support armed conflict over negotiations.
And I would add, Alan, and I agree with you, but I would also add that on the PA, the West Bank, Abbas, and those guys, the recognition for a two-state Palestine and Israel is a non-starter as far as the position that the Palestinians are taking, namely that they have the right to return, that East Jerusalem will be their capital, and that they're going to take over all the land on the West Bank, on the so-called West Bank. Mm-hmm. Israel never.
That becomes a more than a delicate issue. You're right, and of course, and I don't know if all our listeners, I'm sure Larry knows and Joy know, that there was a deal that Yasser Arafat was given, a great deal that apparently every negotiator at Camp David who was in the Palestinian negotiating nation team agreed with, but one person didn't, and that was Yasser Arafat. And the deal included 92% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem as a capital, half of Jerusalem under Palestinian control. Yeah. And Yasser Arafat, in my view, wanted a cause, not a solution. And so he said no. And President Clinton at the time said, you're basically sentencing your people in the region to a catastrophe. And he was right. So you're correct. And I don't know if Israel, I don't know how you can't negotiate with someone who wants to eliminate you. Precisely. You can negotiate with people who disagree on where a map is drawn. And I think that's where the PA is different than Hamas, but certainly not an easy neighbor or an easy friend to work or a neighbor to live next to.
And I think it goes back, Alan, to the fundamental issue also of the fact that the United Nations and the United States has funneled billions of dollars into the Palestinian cause as refugees. And as you know, throughout the world, refugees have taken place between India and Pakistan. And after World War II, there was huge refugees all over Europe. And they've all settled. And yet the Palestinian refugees continue to fester, thanks to aid from the West.
That's right.
My feeling is we should just stop all aid, stop the UN, stop funding the UN, at least from our perspective, and let the Arabs take care of the Arabs. Beyond my comprehension.
It's a great point, and it's very telling, isn't it, that and people like Larry and I who study this know that this has always existed, but it's very telling. It's exposed in October of 2023, and now we're into November, that Arab states closed their borders to what they call their brothers. And I when I teach my courses, and I do speaking engagements, I just look at Ukraine. Ukraine comes under attack, by Russia, creates refugees. Wars create refugees, and who takes the Ukrainians in? Their neighbors, mostly Europeans. We took some in too. Here's a war, and Egypt closes its border, and that is very telling. Larry, you're right. The aid spigot that just pours into Palestine, to Gaza at least, has been terribly misused. We know the stories that they're building tunnels to move weapons. They use water pipes to create makeshift missile tubes. The Egyptians and the Israelis both have to go in and tear up or flood tunnels that are used to move terrorists and weapons. So you're exactly right, Larry. The aid is misused, doesn't get to the people who need it. 2.1 million people in Gaza, and they are mistreated as well by these people who misrule that area.
Yeah, and of course then you have Iran in the background festering the whole thing, and America's the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan. So they basically want to end both Israel and the United States, and Iran is that theocratic dictatorship that basically hates the Western civilization. So they might be going after the U.S., but they're really going after Western civilization.
Yeah, very good points, both of you. And I say, when I saw those polls too, Alan, that you mentioned, and that's why I used fair elections very lightly, because I wondered if those people are under stress to say something that they really don't believe or poll differently than they really believe. And then you also both brought up a good point about the tunnels. So my understanding is that some of these tunnels have been previously already built underneath numerous buildings, probably schools, maybe some hospitals. So when we see hospitals destroyed or schools destroyed, a lot of times Israel's likely going after these tunnels, and in the meantime, other things are being destroyed.
Yes.
Right. There's like I said, just recently, Egypt destroyed 37. Israel they thought, created an anti-tunnel system and a way to prevent terrorists from moving into southern Israel. That obviously failed. Walls generally, throughout military history, enemies find a way around walls. And that's what happened on October 7. But it's you're dealing with an organization that is against Israel as a state. Larry brought up the UN. I think our listeners know, but I think it's sad that fewer and fewer Americans know if these protest marches are any indication of what's happening at college campuses. The UN created Israel, overwhelming majority support of UN for a 50,000 word plan that it may not have been as wise as Solomon, but it was as close as could be for an Arab and Jewish states next to each other, economic union, capitals situated, borders clear and defined. And, the Arabs rejected that and sentenced the Palestinians to a stateless future. But that being said, I totally agree with Larry. The UN role in Gaza is despicable. It has, in some cases, taken the side of terrorism. Some cases cooperates with them, and it really is why Israel will, I think, not just destroy Hamas, but probably say we can't have the UN Relief and Works Agency really in charge down there anymore. It'll have to be a different international entity.
Alan, since you teach in the universities, you seeing the universities where you live partake in the anti-Israeli demonstrations at all?
Oh, well, I'm just an adjunct, but it's saddening to me, Larry. I was just gave a talk today with some young people and a mix of folks. It wasn't a university, but it's saddening and telling to me, and I'll be honest, worrisome that there is you and I know about the 67, the 73, and of course the 48 war. There's generally an immediate U.S. reaction that will support Israel because it's a democracy, because it's a besieged country surrounded by giant neighbors that are dictatorships. And while our government has done that, there does not seem to be a broad base of broad base of support, especially among younger generations. The millennials and then Generation Y. Generation Y are the folks that are in college and getting through college now, just not as broad base of support. And I think it's partly because they don't know the history of the situation. But yeah, I think, Larry, that's troubling to me. That I'm surprised when students don't know about 48 when they're in 47. There was 2-state solution offered. They think that this was just a dictator to the Israel seized territory, which didn't happen. It's really has so many problems, as you know, Larry, and Joy knows a lack of history or lack of understanding of history leads to huge problems.
Yes, very well put, which is why we are also trying to incorporate American History Live here. But also, I'm glad you brought up the universities and the protests, because Larry and I have discussed on other podcasts the amount of influx of money coming from the Middle East countries to our universities, particularly Qatar, who are harboring Hamas leaders.
Billions.
Right, Larry, want to talk about that?
Well, billions have come from Arab countries, and particularly Qatar. And as Joy has already mentioned, the leaders of Hamas live in Qatar in a luxury surroundings. So Qatar has played the middleman. And to me, one of the great ironies is Qatar was where the Taliban came, apparently at the behest of the United States, where they could hold negotiations. And we all know how the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban ended up. And now we're in a situation where Hamas is negotiating in Qatar with the United States and the Israelis, and we all know how that's probably going to end up nowhere. They remember the hostages. They're going to drib and drab the hostages out in the hope that the Israelis would hold back. And after a few days, the Israelis figured that was a waste of time and began the military launch. And the Israeli position right now is there's no ceasefire until the hostages are released. And why isn't there a huge cry about hostage taking of innocents and in the massacre and the raping and the beheading of people? How could anyone justify the Hamas actions? And the sympathizers of Hamas say it was because of occupation. And as Alan, as you said, the occupation was done a deal a long time ago, and the Arabs are the ones that have blown it up. So,
right.
Thank you, Larry. Go ahead, Alan.
You go ahead, Joy.
I was going to say, Larry walked right into my next point, and what you had written in your article, Alan, is that, I mean, women, children, babies, and the elderly were taken, some grotesquely killed in front of others. The ones taken hostage, many of them were paraded around streets of Gaza, much like, as you said, similar to ISIS.
Right.
Alan, you also stated in your article that millions in the free world are unwilling to believe what their eyes see or what survivors say. Mm-hmm. And Larry has said on a past podcast with me that the news just doesn't portray the horrors of what the terrorists or authoritarian governments do to distant. So my second question to both of you is, why is this? Why is the world unwilling to face the wrongs of Hamas's massacres, or Alan, as you've mentioned in your article, the Holocaust, or you both discussed before, China's treatment of the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong?
I think I tried to separate, because I think America's an exceptional nation and the greatest nation, the world's response from our response, and it pains me that our response, at least the ones that we're seeing in the protest march class and in some of these, you could say, just anecdotal videos that we all are seeing, it pains me that many Americans, especially younger, are reacting the way the world would. And that's disappointing, because we're better than that. It's not, you guys mentioned it, it's not fair, it's not just, it doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense. It almost sounds, when you listen to some of these 20-somethings and late teenagers talk, they almost sound as if they've been brainwashed. And that goes back to education system, where people are being taught what to think rather than how to think. There's no critical thinking taught at all. We've seen that in a whole bunch of ways. And so that's part of it. And I do think another part of it is there was a great reversal that happened in the way the world views Israel. In the 1940s, because of the Holocaust, the nascent Jewish state, what we came to call Israel, was seen as a besieged, proud people that have survived and that were an underdog, a newborn nation that was rising up and had defeated a terrible injustice, terrible oppression. And then by 67, a little after 67, the 67 war, Israel, the global view generally starts to shift toward it. It is an oppressor. And they even use idiotically a term like colonial, which is idiotic when you talk about Israel. And I think that shift, maybe it has to do with the fact that Israel has occupied territories. There are some reasons for that are geostrategic and security related. But Israel also has given up land for peace many, many, many times. And as Larry mentioned at the top of the show, the consequence of that has been attacks from the places it's given up land. So there are reasons for that. There's nuance, but people don't think in nuance. People don't want to hear about the fullness of things. And so that's kind of a long-winded way to say that that's how I try to understand this shift that's happened. I'm very disappointed in what we're seeing in America. Now, that being said, I do believe there is a larger silent majority. We're seeing that in Congress. If Congress reflects the people it serves, Congress overwhelmingly is moving toward an emergency package for Israel. Congress overwhelmingly is supporting Israel. So maybe and hopefully just these protest march class folks are just a loud minority.
I would add to your observation, Alan, and I agree with him 100%. But I think the root cause of the younger generation versus the older generation is that the younger generation has been educated by Marxists. I think the education system has become Marxist, especially beginning with the Vietnam War, where the draft dodgers went into education, and it's just permeated the entire educational system for the universities on down. And as you know, Marxism is basically a philosophy of grievances. It's the oppressor versus the oppressed, the whites versus the black or brown or whatever. But it's always about grievances and oppressed versus oppressors. And in this case, Israel is the oppressor, and the Palestinians are the oppressed. And so the young Marxists claim that they'll go with the oppressed versus the oppressor. That's why they hate capitalism, because, again, they've been steeped in the education system of rich versus poor, landowner versus the proletariat. Of course, it's all phony. It's a false philosophy that appeals to certain intellectual elites types who think they're better than Joe Blow, who's making $100,000 a year being a welder, when they have their PhD in gender studies and they're making $40,000 a year. So it's,
that's right. And that, this is a whole nother podcast. Larry's right, and I know Joy and ASCF focuses on that, rightly so. That view of the world, the victimhood, the grievance mentality, and it is Marxist at its core, is just fundamentally at odds with the American creed and the American worldview as laid down in our founding documents. And that is wholly at odds with that. The idea that there will be rule of law, there will be the ability to pursue what you define as happiness. There'll be majority rules, minority rights, political, religious pluralism. All those things are at odds with this grievance mentality, and that someone else is always to blame. And that the powerful are always bad. That's another thing, that is brought in, certainly in these college campuses. So it is worrisome to me over the long haul. I was asked today in a speech I gave, and it dawned on me, the person was talking about generations, and it dawned on me, if this specific crisis, let's say this had happened October 7, 2033, I don't know if our government would respond the same way, just because maybe the Congress will be, the makeup of Congress will be so much different, and that's a worrisome idea to me.
Yes.
Yeah, Larry, I don't know if the Marxists are teaching, as Alan said, 1948 two-state solution either.
Right. They're not. They are definitely not.
Well, and Larry, to you, back to Iran, where you were talking about Iran. We know that Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are all proxies backed by Iran. And Iran makes no doubt the claim that they don't want Israel to exist, and they are no fan of the United States, probably except for our money. And Larry, you wrote China supplies money to Iran in exchange for much needed oil and gas. And China has also condemned Israel for the atrocities against the Palestinians in Gaza.
Well, it can be
much as we talked about the kettle calling.
Right.
I'm saying that wrong.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely
Pot
right.
calling the kettle black.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Calling the kettle black.
So my final question is: in your have your own opinions, but do you think China is the biggest problem or a big problem of their funding of these proxies organizations in order to ultimately undermine Israel and the U.S., or are they just in it for the money?
And Larry can start if he wants, or
go ahead, Larry.
As I've mentioned in some of my papers, the common theme between the Chinese civilization and the Islamic civilization is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And China is has an enemy, the United States. The Islamic civilization has an enemy in Western civilization. So China will work with them to bring down Western civilization. And of course, who leads this Western civilization is the United States. If the United States folds, then there is no Western civilization. And so China makes a deal with Iran primarily because they have oil and gas that China desperately needs to feed its manufacturing base. and also the fact that they're going after the U.S., so they're buddies on that score. And the money that Iran makes from the sale of oil to China goes into funding Hezbollah and Hamas and all these other terrorist organizations. So the oil is fungible and money is fungible, so it sloshes back and forth. But if you look at who the enemy is, I think that's the driving force between Iran, China, and the terror groups.
Yeah, I would say just piggybacking on that, I agree with Larry's point. We're saying that a lot the last 30 minutes, which is a good thing. But just piggybacking on that, China thinks PRC thinks in a much longer view than we do. We probably, I've argued, and I think we need a grand strategy for what I call Cold War 2.0. We had one in the first Cold War. Men like Kennan and Truman and Eisenhower came up with a plan, and basically America followed a basic plan of containment and deterrence to deal with that threat. We don't really have such a plan. The Chinese are thinking further ahead than us. The Chinese are the PRC. I should emphasize. Larry talks about enemy of my enemy. They don't have to worry about things like what we worry about, like the ethics and the human rights issues. The Chinese PRC doesn't care about that. And then just to close, just not speaking to speaking to the choir here, you two certainly know, but I hope our listeners think about, and maybe some on YouTube, that just think of the hypocrisy. Just think of the cynical nature of the Iranian regime, that it will work with the PRC and not say word one about the brutalization of a Muslim population inside the PRC, the Uyghur Muslims. Yeah. I mean, brutal genocidal treatment. International agencies, 2 different U.S. administrations have called it genocide. And they don't say word one about that, but they take the money, they take the things they need to take from China, but that's the cynical nature of the Iranian regime, what an irony. You have the People's Republic of China, which believes the state should control all things, including religion. You have the Islamic Republic of Iran, which believes religion should control all things, including the state. If any 2 entities should never work together, right, it would be those 2. But yes, yet they do see the enemy of their enemies being common, and they don't have any qualms, or they don't care about hypocrisy, and they are truly creating a great amount of disorder, chaos, and Iran, especially in the region. Yes. Larry mentioned Hezbollah, and Joy, you mentioned Hamas and the Houthis, and it's Iran is a real, source of chaos in that region, really from Iran all the way over. A lot of Americans don't know Iran right now. They always say Sunnis and Shiite jihadists don't work together. The heck they don't. Iran right now has al-Qaeda's leader inside Iran protecting him. Iran gives money to Sunni and Shiite groups, radical jihadist groups that are targeting and killing Israelis. So Iran is a true problem. The administration has dealt with them very poorly, I would submit, since it came in. Hopefully this is a wake-up call. There have been cases where administrations get wake-up calls. One of the classic cases in the recent history is the Carter administration just basically did an about-face on everything in late 1979. And indeed, the Reagan buildup actually starts under Carter, and Carter starts to deal with the world as it is rather than how he wishes it to be. And I hope the Biden administration does that now.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, I agree. And Alan, thank you for pointing out that the PRC, or as Larry and I say, the CCP, Communist.
Yes, that's even better.
China,
yeah, the party.
Not the people, not the Chinese people, because I believe there is a big disconnect between a lot of governments and probably the Iranian government and their people as well. That's
for sure. And CCP is even better. And we got an important committee in Congress that actually, they were smart. The guys and women who formed that committee, It's called something to the effect of Special Select Committee on countering the CCP, not the Chinese, not even the PRC. And that was smart to think that way, because it is the CCP that's the locus of the problem.
Yeah, one of my themes, Alan, is reciprocity. And I hear that mentioned now. Gallagher, I think, is heading up from Wisconsin, is heading up the committee. And my feeling is that TikTok is a poison in American culture, just like fentanyl is poisoning American culture. TikTok is the fentanyl of digital media, and it's poisoning American culture. And I hear the argument from Rand Paul, who's taken a ton of money from pro-Chinese advocates of TikTok, that it's a freedom of speech issue. It's not a freedom of speech issue, it's a security issue. That we're allowing a foreign organization where our young are getting their information and news from. And the reciprocity angle makes it very simple, in my opinion. If the Chinese do not allow Google and Facebook and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to operate in China, then we shouldn't allow their media to operate in America. And until they do, I say ban TikTok and all Chinese media kind of organizations in America. And
I think that's one. It would be very. I think it's very understandable to the average American. Two, I think it's the definition of reasonable. And three, it puts the ball in China's court.
Precisely.
And four, because we all are working with the Reagan organization, that's the kind of thing President Reagan did. Okay, we'll open up this if you open up that on your side. If you don't, we're not going to deal with you. It's very simple, and it is the way to deal with a dictator nation like China. And China holds some cards, but I think we need to let them know we hold more cards, and we really do. And we just don't play them very well. And those things that you're mentioning, Larry, I think those are great starting points. They're not good. They're bloodless. They're not hurting anyone, except for they get the message across to the PRC, the CCP, that we're not going to play with one or both hands tied behind our back. And you referenced, Larry, it's not just things like digital platforms like TikTok. There are Chinese media firms actually that operate in the U.S. There's no reason that we have to allow that. We believe in the First Amendment for American media companies. And if you don't allow us to have the Wall Street Journal have an office that's unencumbered in Beijing, or CNN that's unencumbered in Beijing, you can't have your CCTV equivalents or China Global News equivalents that are under different names sometimes here.
Yes.
And certainly would stop a lot of propaganda and misinformation. And since we're talking about the Israeli war here, I would say also with the Israeli war, a lot of misinformation out there.
For sure.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen, for coming on, and thank you for your very thoughtful insights on all this. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Alan. Thank
you, Alan.
Larry.
Take care.
And to our listeners, you can read both Alan and Larry's articles at www.ascf.us. You can subscribe to our newsletter and receive updates on new articles coming out and podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Substack. Please subscribe to our YouTube and Rumble channels by typing in the American Security Council Foundation. And thank you again to all our listeners, Alan, Larry, and join us again next time as we bring you the podcast on Peace Through Strength.